The metallic clink of chains echoed through the sterile corridor as Master Chief Sarah Martinez was led toward the military tribunal chamber. Each step sent a sharp reminder of her current predicament through the cold steel shackles that bound her wrists and ankles. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead cast unforgiving shadows across her weathered face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw despite the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. Behind her, Sergeant Davies pushed forward with unnecessary force, his heavy boots creating a rhythmic percussion against the polished concrete floor. The man seemed to take particular pleasure in this assignment, his meaty fingers gripping her shoulder with more pressure than protocol required. Sarah had encountered his type before in her years of service, those who viewed her presence in elite units as an affront to their traditional understanding of military hierarchy. The double doors ahead loomed like a gateway to judgment, their imposing brass handles gleaming under the institutional lighting. Through the narrow windows, Sarah could glimpse the packed tribunal chamber beyond, filled with uniformed personnel, civilian observers, and what appeared to be members of the military press corps. Their collective murmur created a low buzz of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. As they approached the entrance, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of a ceremonial plaque mounted beside the doors. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the decorated operator she truly was. Gone was the confident bearing that had carried her through countless classified missions in hostile territories. In its place stood someone who appeared diminished by the weight of false accusations and the systematic dismantling of her reputation. The charges against her were as fabricated as they were damning. Insubordination, conduct unbecoming an officer, and the most serious allegation of compromising operational security during a classified mission. Each accusation had been carefully crafted to destroy not just her career, but her very identity as a soldier. What her accusers did not realize was that beneath the surface of this apparent disgrace lay a truth so explosive it could reshape their understanding of military excellence. Sergeant Davies paused at the threshold, his radio crackling with final instructions from the tribunal coordinator. Colonel Bradley Hutchins, the presiding officer, wanted to ensure maximum visibility for what he termed a necessary example. The message was clear: this public humiliation was intended to send a message to any other woman who might dare to challenge the established order. Where in the world are you watching this unfold, and what time is it where you are? Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when people from across the globe witness truth emerging from darkness. Sarah took one final breath before stepping through those doors, knowing that everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, hung in the balance of what was about to unfold in that chamber. The tribunal chamber erupted in a symphony of whispers and shifting bodies as Sarah was escorted down the central aisle. Camera flashes pierced the formal atmosphere despite regulations prohibiting such documentation, their harsh light creating a strobe effect that transformed her walk into a surreal procession of humiliation. The chains around her ankles forced her into an awkward shuffle that drew snickers from some of the younger officers seated in the gallery. Colonel Bradley Hutchins sat behind the elevated bench like a predator surveying his territory. His steel-gray hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform immaculate, and his pale blue eyes held the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he was about to make military history. To his left and right sat the other tribunal members, their faces displaying varying degrees of discomfort with the theatrical nature of these proceedings. The media representatives leaned forward in their designated section, pens poised and recording devices ready to capture what promised to be a career-ending spectacle. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos from the Judge Advocate General's office watched with barely concealed disgust at the obvious prejudice displayed in Sarah's treatment. She had reviewed the case files and found them suspiciously thin on actual evidence. As Sarah was positioned at the defendant's table, her court-appointed attorney, Captain James Morrison, barely looked up from his notes. His nervous energy and frequent glances toward Colonel Hutchins revealed his true loyalties in this matter. Morrison had been carefully selected for his reputation as someone who would not fight too hard for unpopular causes. The gallery contained a mixture of personnel representing various branches and ranks. Some watched with genuine curiosity, others with obvious disdain, and a few with what appeared to be recognition flickering in their eyes before they quickly looked away. These were the ones who might have encountered Sarah during classified operations, bound by secrecy agreements that prevented them from speaking the truth about her actual service record. Hutchins gavelled the session to order with theatrical precision, his voice carrying across the chamber with practiced authority. The charges will be read, and this tribunal will demonstrate that the United States military maintains the highest standards regardless of political pressure or social experimentation, he announced, his words dripping with barely concealed contempt for the defendant before him. Sarah remained motionless throughout this opening display, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the tribunal members. Those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the controlled breathing of someone accustomed to maintaining composure under extreme pressure. Her silence was not submission but rather the quiet confidence of someone who possessed knowledge that could shatter every assumption in that room. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true character shone through despite impossible circumstances? Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who remain calm when everyone else loses control. The formal reading of charges was about to begin, and with it, the systematic attempt to destroy a reputation built through years of sacrifice and service that none of these tribunal members could even imagine. The tribunal clerk, a nervous young corporal with trembling hands, began reading the charges in a voice that barely carried beyond the first row of observers. Master Chief Sarah Martinez stands accused of willful insubordination during Operation Sandstorm, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and the unauthorized disclosure of classified operational parameters to unauthorized personnel, he recited mechanically, each word falling like a hammer blow against Sarah's reputation. Colonel Hutchins leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction as the charges were enumerated. These were serious allegations, carefully crafted to paint a picture of a rogue operator who had violated the sacred trust placed in elite military personnel. What the tribunal members and observers could not know was that Operation Sandstorm itself was so classified that most of the people in that room lacked the security clearance to even hear its name spoken aloud. Captain Morrison shuffled through his papers with increasing agitation, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the charges and the political implications of this case. His opening statement would be perfunctory at best, a token defense designed more to satisfy procedural requirements than to mount any meaningful challenge to the prosecution's narrative. In the gallery, Major Thomas Rodriguez felt a chill of recognition when Operation Sandstorm was mentioned. He had been stationed at Joint Special Operations Command Headquarters during that timeframe, and while he had never been briefed on the operation's details, he remembered the unusual security protocols and the whispered conversations that stopped whenever unauthorized personnel approached. Something about this entire proceeding felt fundamentally wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Santos continued taking detailed notes, her legal mind identifying numerous procedural irregularities and evidentiary gaps in the case presentation. The prosecution's reliance on classified materials that could not be examined or challenged in open court struck her as a convenient way to avoid scrutiny of their accusations. Her experience in military justice told her this case was built on foundations of sand rather than solid evidence. Sarah's expression remained unchanged throughout the reading of charges, but those with trained eyes might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes when Operation Sandstorm was mentioned. That mission held memories both triumphant and tragic, involving actions that had saved countless lives while costing her pieces of her soul that could never be recovered. The media representatives scribbled furiously, sensing a story that would dominate military news cycles for weeks to come. Female SEAL facing court-martial for compromising national security would make compelling headlines, regardless of the actual truth behind the charges. They had no way of knowing they were witnessing the attempted destruction of one of the military's most valuable assets. Hutchins called for the first witness, an intelligence analyst named Staff Sergeant Bradley Chen who had supposedly observed Sarah's alleged security violations. Chen approached the witness stand with obvious reluctance, his eyes never quite meeting Sarah's gaze as he was sworn in. His testimony would form the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, built entirely on misrepresentations and carefully omitted context that would transform routine operational procedures into evidence of criminal behavior. Staff Sergeant Chen's testimony unfolded like a carefully rehearsed performance, each word precisely calculated to paint Sarah as a dangerous security risk. He claimed to have witnessed her sharing operational details with unauthorized personnel in the mess hall at Forward Operating Base Scorpion, his voice gaining confidence as he recounted the fabricated incident with increasing detail. I observed Master Chief Martinez discussing mission parameters with what appeared to be civilian contractors who lacked proper security clearances, Chen stated, his eyes fixed firmly on Colonel Hutchins rather than the defendant. She was showing them photographs and discussing tactical positions in direct violation of operational security protocols. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she listened to this fiction being presented as fact. The truth was that she had been briefing a joint task force that included intelligence operatives whose clearances were actually higher than Chen's own. But those operatives worked under such deep cover that their identities could never be revealed in open court, making Chen's lies impossible to refute through conventional means. Captain Morrison rose to cross-examine, his nervous energy palpable as he approached the witness stand. His questions were softball inquiries that did little to challenge Chen's account, occasionally eliciting responses that actually strengthened the prosecution's case. It became increasingly clear that Morrison was either incompetent or deliberately sabotaging his own client's defense. Lieutenant Colonel Santos observed this legal theater with growing alarm. Chen's testimony contained numerous inconsistencies that any competent defense attorney should have identified and exploited. The timing of his alleged observations didn't align with known operational schedules, and his descriptions of security protocols revealed gaps in his own knowledge that should have undermined his credibility as a witness. In the gallery, Major Rodriguez found himself studying Sarah's profile with increasing recognition. Something about her bearing, the controlled stillness that spoke of extensive combat experience, triggered memories of classified briefings where certain operators were discussed only in whispers. The name Martinez had appeared in reports he had reviewed, always associated with operations so sensitive that full details were restricted to the highest levels of command. The prosecution's second witness was called, a young lieutenant named Patricia Walsh who claimed to have documented security violations in her capacity as a communications officer. Walsh appeared even more reluctant than Chen, her hands visibly shaking as she was sworn in. Her testimony would focus on alleged breaches of communication protocols, painting Sarah as someone who consistently ignored established procedures in favor of reckless improvisation. As Walsh began her testimony, several experienced officers in the gallery exchanged knowing glances. Combat veterans recognized the difference between textbook protocols and the adaptive decision-making required in actual operations. What the prosecution was characterizing as violations were likely examples of the tactical flexibility that separated elite operators from ordinary soldiers. Sarah remained motionless throughout these proceedings, but beneath her calm exterior, she was cataloging every lie, every distortion, every piece of manufactured evidence being used to destroy her reputation. Her silence was not resignation but rather the patience of someone who understood that truth had a way of surfacing when the stakes were highest. Lieutenant Walsh's testimony crumbled under even the most basic scrutiny, her fabricated account falling apart as she struggled to remember details of events that had never actually occurred. She claimed Sarah had used unauthorized communication channels during a classified operation, but her description of radio frequencies and encryption protocols revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how special operations communications actually functioned. Colonel Hutchins grew visibly agitated as Walsh's credibility evaporated before the tribunal. His carefully orchestrated case was beginning to show cracks, and several observers in the gallery were now openly skeptical of the proceedings. The prosecution had relied too heavily on witnesses who lacked the operational experience to make their lies convincing to anyone with actual combat knowledge. Master Chief Rodriguez found himself leaning forward in his seat as fragments of memory began coalescing into recognition. The Martinez mentioned in classified after-action reports had been described as a precision marksman with an extraordinary record of successful operations in hostile territory. That same report had noted her ability to adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations, exactly the kind of flexibility that incompetent witnesses were now characterizing as protocol violations. Sarah's court-appointed attorney finally showed a spark of competence during his cross-examination of Walsh, pressing her on technical details that exposed the superficial nature of her knowledge. Captain Morrison seemed surprised by his own effectiveness as Walsh contradicted her earlier testimony, her nervous energy transforming into obvious panic as she realized her rehearsed story was unraveling. In the media section, veteran military correspondent Janet Harrison began questioning the narrative she had initially accepted. 20 years of covering military justice had taught her to recognize the difference between legitimate misconduct cases and political show trials. The prosecution's witnesses lacked the ring of authenticity that characterized genuine whistleblowers, and their testimony felt more like performance art than factual reporting. Lieutenant Colonel Santos continued documenting every procedural irregularity and evidentiary weakness she observed. Her notes were becoming a comprehensive catalogue of prosecutorial misconduct that could potentially form the basis for an appeal, assuming Sarah survived this tribunal with any semblance of her career intact. The systematic nature of the problem suggested coordination at levels far above Colonel Hutchins. What would you do if you witnessed someone being systematically destroyed by lies and manipulation? Sometimes standing up for truth requires more courage than we think we possess. As the morning session drew to a close, subtle shifts in the gallery's mood became apparent. Whispered conversations between experienced officers revealed growing skepticism about the charges, and several individuals were beginning to study Sarah with expressions of recognition rather than condemnation. The prosecution's case was built on foundations that were beginning to crack under scrutiny. Sarah maintained her stoic composure throughout these developments, but those who knew how to read the signs might have noticed the slight relaxation in her shoulders as the truth began its inevitable emergence from beneath layers of fabrication and political maneuvering. The afternoon session resumed with Colonel Hutchins calling his star witness, a decorated intelligence officer named Commander David Preston, who claimed to have direct knowledge of Sarah's alleged security breaches. Preston approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who believed his rank and reputation would lend credibility to whatever narrative he chose to present. Preston's testimony was more sophisticated than the previous witnesses, weaving together half-truths and classified details in a way designed to be impossible to refute in open court. He described Sarah as a rogue operator who consistently ignored chain-of-command protocols and made unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence assets during joint operations in undisclosed locations. However, Preston made a critical error when he referenced specific operational details that only someone with his level of clearance should have known. Major Rodriguez felt his blood run cold as he recognized classified information being discussed in open court, information so sensitive that its mere mention violated federal statutes regarding the protection of national security assets. Lieutenant Colonel Santos immediately began taking detailed notes about Preston's unauthorized disclosures, recognizing that the commander was committing the very crimes he was accusing Sarah of perpetrating. The irony was lost on Colonel Hutchins, who nodded approvingly at what he perceived as devastating testimony against the defendant. Sarah's expression remained unchanged, but several astute observers noticed that her breathing had become more controlled, the kind of focused respiration used by snipers to maintain accuracy under extreme pressure. For the first time since the proceedings began, she appeared to be preparing for action rather than simply enduring persecution. Captain Morrison rose for cross-examination with unexpected vigor, perhaps finally recognizing that his client might actually be innocent of the charges against her. His questions targeted the inconsistencies in Preston's account, pressing the commander on details that revealed significant gaps between his testimony and documented operational procedures. The gallery atmosphere shifted perceptibly as Preston's credibility began to erode under sustained questioning. Several senior officers exchanged meaningful glances as they recognized the pattern of projection that characterized Preston's accusations, painting Sarah with crimes that his own testimony suggested he had committed. Media correspondent Harrison started connecting dots between Preston's unauthorized disclosures and recent intelligence leaks that had compromised ongoing operations in multiple theaters. Her investigative instincts were screaming that this tribunal was not what it appeared to be, and that the Real story might be the exact opposite of what was being presented. Have you ever watched truth slowly emerge from beneath layers of deception? Sometimes the most powerful revelations come not from dramatic announcements but from the gradual accumulation of evidence that can no longer be ignored. As Preston's testimony continued, hairline cracks in the prosecution's facade became visible fractures. The man who was supposed to seal Sarah's fate was instead revealing the corruption and incompetence that had necessitated this show trial in the first place. Commander Preston's composure began to crack as Captain Morrison's questions became increasingly pointed. The intelligence officer found himself trapped between his fabricated narrative and the classified realities he could not discuss without further compromising national security. His attempts to deflect scrutiny only drew more attention to the glaring inconsistencies in his testimony. Morrison pressed his advantage with newfound confidence, asking Preston to clarify the operational timeline he had described. When was this alleged breach of protocol supposed to have occurred, and how did Preston's presence at a classified briefing in Langley align with his claimed observations of Sarah's activities in a combat zone thousands of miles away? The question hung in the air like a live grenade as Preston realized his carefully constructed lies had created an impossible scenario. His face flushed red as he struggled to reconcile the contradictions in his own testimony, while Colonel Hutchins watched his star witness self-destruct in real time. Major Rodriguez felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place as he observed Preston's meltdown. The intelligence officer's unauthorized knowledge of certain classified operations suggested he was the actual source of security leaks that had been plaguing joint task forces for months. Sarah was not the perpetrator of these crimes but rather their intended scapegoat. Lieutenant Colonel Santos recognized the legal significance of what was unfolding before the tribunal. Preston's testimony was not merely unreliable but potentially criminal, involving the unauthorized disclosure of classified information in a desperate attempt to frame an innocent service member. Her documentation of these proceedings was becoming evidence of a conspiracy rather than simple prosecutorial misconduct. In the gallery, whispered conversations became more animated as experienced officers recognized the implications of Preston's contradictory statements. Several individuals who had initially viewed Sarah with suspicion now regarded her with something approaching respect, recognizing that she was maintaining operational security even while being falsely accused of violating it. Sarah's stillness had transformed from passive endurance to predatory focus. Those familiar with combat psychology would recognize the shift from defensive positioning to tactical readiness, the subtle preparation that preceded decisive action. Her silence was no longer submission but rather the calm before an inevitable storm. Media correspondent Harrison began typing furiously on her tablet, recognizing that she was witnessing a story far more significant than a routine court-martial. The systematic destruction of Preston's credibility suggested a cover-up of massive proportions, with implications that could reach the highest levels of military intelligence. Think about the most resilient person you know. What gives someone the strength to remain calm when their entire world is being systematically destroyed by lies? Sometimes true strength is measured not by what we do, but by what we choose not to do. As Preston's testimony concluded in obvious failure, the prosecution's case lay in ruins around Colonel Hutchins. The tribunal that was supposed to make an example of Sarah had instead exposed the corruption and incompetence of her accusers, setting the stage for revelations that would shake the foundations of military justice. Colonel Hutchins called for a brief recess, his face flushed with barely controlled rage as he realized his carefully orchestrated tribunal was collapsing around him. The prosecution's case had not merely faltered but had exposed systemic corruption within his own command structure. His political ambitions, built on the destruction of Sarah's reputation, were evaporating before his eyes. During the break, Major Rodriguez approached Lieutenant Colonel Santos with urgent whispers about operational security violations he had witnessed during Preston's testimony. The two officers huddled in intense conversation, comparing notes about classified information that had been improperly disclosed during what was supposed to be routine court-martial proceedings. Sarah remained seated at the defendant's table, her chains preventing any meaningful movement despite the recess. Several junior officers who had initially avoided eye contact now studied her with newfound curiosity and respect. Word was spreading through the gallery that something significant was happening, that this tribunal was revealing truths far more important than the charges against a single service member. Captain Morrison used the recess to frantically review case files he had previously ignored, finally recognizing that his client might actually be innocent of all charges. His cursory preparation had been based on the assumption that Sarah was guilty and that his role was merely to provide token representation. Now he found himself scrambling to understand the real facts of a case that appeared to involve national security implications he had never imagined. Media correspondent Harrison cornered several experienced officers for off-the-record conversations about the proceedings they had just witnessed. Their reluctance to speak openly only confirmed her suspicions that this tribunal involved classified matters far beyond the scope of routine military justice. Her sources hinted at ongoing investigations into intelligence leaks that had compromised operations across multiple theaters. The gallery buzzed with subdued conversations as personnel from various commands shared fragments of information about recent security breaches and operational failures. A pattern was emerging that suggested Sarah had been selected as a scapegoat for systemic problems that reached far beyond any individual service member's actions. Lieutenant Colonel Santos reviewed her extensive notes, recognizing that she had documented what appeared to be a deliberate conspiracy to destroy an innocent service member's career. Her legal training told her that the procedural violations alone were sufficient grounds for dismissal of all charges, but the implications of Preston's unauthorized disclosures suggested criminal activity that demanded immediate investigation. Sarah's breathing remained controlled and steady, the disciplined respiration of someone maintaining tactical readiness despite physical constraints. Her eyes tracked movement throughout the gallery with the systematic awareness that characterized elite operators conducting threat assessments in hostile environments. As the recess concluded and participants returned to their seats, the atmosphere in the chamber had fundamentally changed. What had begun as Sarah's public humiliation was transforming into an exposure of the corruption and incompetence that had necessitated her sacrifice. The chains that bound her were becoming symbols not of her guilt but of the lengths to which her enemies would go to silence inconvenient truths. When proceedings resumed, Colonel Hutchins made a desperate attempt to salvage his crumbling case by calling an unscheduled witness. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Torres had supposedly observed Sarah's alleged misconduct during a joint training exercise, but his nervous demeanor and reluctance to make eye contact suggested he was another reluctant participant in this manufactured drama. Torres's testimony proved even more damaging to the prosecution than helpful, as his description of Sarah's supposed violations actually painted a picture of exemplary tactical decision-making under pressure. He described her ability to coordinate multiple assets during a simulated combat scenario, inadvertently highlighting the kind of operational excellence that characterized elite special operations personnel. Major Rodriguez found himself studying Sarah with intense focus as Torres unwittingly provided details about her tactical capabilities. The training exercise being described was actually a classified evaluation used to identify candidates for the most sensitive special operations assignments. Sarah's performance during that exercise had apparently been so exceptional that it was still being discussed months later. Lieutenant Colonel Santos recognized that Torres's testimony was effectively providing character evidence in Sarah's favor, despite the witness's obvious intention to support the prosecution. His descriptions of her leadership under pressure and ability to make split-second decisions that saved lives directly contradicted the narrative of reckless insubordination that formed the core of the charges against her. Captain Morrison finally demonstrated competent legal skills during his cross-examination of Torres, drawing out additional details about Sarah's exemplary performance during the training scenario. The witness found himself describing tactical innovations and leadership decisions that would have earned commendations rather than court-martial charges under normal circumstances. The gallery atmosphere continued its transformation from hostile skepticism to grudging respect as Torres's testimony revealed the caliber of operator Sarah actually was. Several senior non-commissioned officers began whispering among themselves about similar training exercises they had observed, comparing notes about the rare individuals who demonstrated the kind of capabilities Torres was inadvertently describing. Sarah's posture had subtly shifted throughout these proceedings, her apparent resignation giving way to controlled alertness that suggested she was preparing for something significant. Those trained in reading body language would recognize the transformation from passive endurance to tactical readiness, the subtle preparation that preceded decisive action. Media correspondent Harrison realized she was witnessing the systematic demolition of a prosecution case that had initially appeared ironclad. Her investigation into the background of these charges was revealing a pattern of retaliation against service members who had reported security violations within their own commands, suggesting Sarah might be a whistleblower rather than a security threat. As Torres concluded his testimony with obvious relief, the fundamental weakness of the prosecution's case had become apparent to everyone in the chamber except Colonel Hutchins himself. Each witness had inadvertently provided evidence of Sarah's competence and integrity while exposing the fabricated nature of the charges against her. The tribunal was approaching a breaking point where truth would finally emerge from beneath layers of deception and political maneuvering. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the tribunal chamber burst open with an authority that instantly commanded every person's attention. Four-star General Patricia Thompson strode into the room with the bearing of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through sheer force of will. Her silver hair was pulled back in a precise military bun, her uniform displayed ribbons representing decades of distinguished service, and her steel-gray eyes surveyed the proceedings with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. The entire chamber rose to attention as one, chairs scraping against the floor in a symphony of startled respect. Even Colonel Hutchins found himself standing despite his position as presiding officer, his face draining of color as he recognized the implications of this unexpected arrival. General Thompson's presence at a routine court-martial could only mean that this case involved matters far beyond the scope of normal military justice. Major Rodriguez felt his heart rate spike as he recognized the legendary figure who had just entered their midst. General Thompson was known throughout special operations communities as the Iron Lady, a commander whose tactical brilliance and unwavering integrity had shaped modern military doctrine. Her personal involvement in any case meant that national security interests of the highest magnitude were at stake. Sarah's reaction to General Thompson's arrival was subtle but profound. For the first time since these proceedings began, genuine emotion flickered across her features. Those trained to read micro-expressions would have recognized relief, vindication, and something approaching hope in the slight relaxation of muscles that had been held rigid for hours. General Thompson's gaze swept across the tribunal members before settling on Sarah with an intensity that suggested deep personal knowledge of the defendant's true value. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the soft rustle of uniforms as nervous personnel shifted in their seats. Lieutenant Colonel Santos recognized the historical significance of this moment, understanding that she was witnessing an intervention by one of the most powerful figures in American military hierarchy. Her legal training told her that General Thompson's presence effectively ended any pretense that this was a routine disciplinary proceeding. The media representatives suddenly found themselves in the presence of a story that transcended military justice and entered the realm of national security drama. Janet Harrison's journalistic instincts screamed that she was about to witness revelations that would reshape public understanding of military operations and the personnel who conducted them. Who among us has ever experienced that moment when rescue arrives just as hope seems lost? Sometimes the most powerful interventions come from those who truly understand what justice requires. General Thompson's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Colonel Hutchins," she said, her words cutting through the chamber like precision ordnance, "I believe there are some matters we need to discuss regarding this defendant and the charges being presented against her." General Thompson approached the tribunal bench with measured steps that resonated through the hushed chamber like countdown to detonation. Her eyes never left Colonel Hutchins as she produced a sealed document folder bearing classifications that made several observers instinctively look away. The folder's red borders and special handling markings indicated contents that could reshape careers or end them entirely. "Colonel," General Thompson began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "are you familiar with the operational designation Ghost 7? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Hutchins's obvious confusion provided all the answer she needed. His ignorance of that classification revealed the fundamental incompetence that had led to this travesty of justice. Major Rodriguez felt recognition explode through his consciousness as pieces of a classified puzzle suddenly aligned. Ghost 7 was a designation he had encountered in the most sensitive after-action reports, always associated with operations so successful they seemed almost mythical. The sniper known by that call sign had become legendary within special operations communities for precision and tactical brilliance that defied conventional understanding. Sarah's chains suddenly seemed less like instruments of restraint and more like grotesque accessories adorning someone whose true value transcended anything these proceedings could diminish. Her stillness had transformed completely, no longer the resigned endurance of a victim but the coiled readiness of an apex predator temporarily constrained by circumstances about to change dramatically. General Thompson continued with devastating precision, describing operational successes that had saved thousands of lives and prevented catastrophic intelligence breaches. Each mission summary she recited painted a picture of tactical genius and unwavering loyalty that made the charges against Sarah appear not merely false but obscenely insulting to the concept of military justice. Lieutenant Colonel Santos found herself documenting what amounted to a masterclass in how classified operations actually functioned, as General Thompson methodically dismantled every assumption underlying the prosecution's case. The actions characterized as insubordination were revealed as split-second tactical decisions that had prevented mission failures and saved American lives. The gallery atmosphere shifted from tension to awe as the true magnitude of Sarah's service record became apparent. Officers who had initially viewed her with suspicion now regarded her with something approaching reverence, recognizing they were in the presence of operational excellence they could barely comprehend. Media correspondent Harrison realized she was witnessing the exposure of one of the military's most valuable and closely guarded assets. The woman sitting in chains before this tribunal was not a security risk but rather a national treasure whose contributions to American security had been deliberately obscured to protect ongoing operations. Have you ever realized that someone you underestimated was actually extraordinary beyond your wildest imagination? Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who carry their strength quietly. General Thompson's revelations continued with systematic precision, each classified detail she disclosed serving to utterly destroy the credibility of Sarah's accusers while revealing the defendant as one of the most decorated and effective operators in modern military history. The transformation in the chamber was complete as truth finally emerged from beneath layers of political maneuvering and bureaucratic incompetence. General Thompson's final revelation shattered the last vestiges of the prosecution's credibility like precision ordnance destroying a carefully constructed facade. Master Chief Martinez, she announced, is not only innocent of these fabricated charges but has been conducting a classified counterintelligence operation to identify the actual sources of security leaks within this command structure. The words hit Colonel Hutchins like a physical blow, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and dawning terror as he realized the magnitude of his error. He had not merely prosecuted an innocent service member but had attempted to destroy someone whose mission was to expose the very corruption he represented. Commander Preston, sitting among the gallery observers, began a desperate attempt to leave the chamber as General Thompson's gaze settled on him with predatory focus. His involvement in actual security breaches was about to be exposed, and his fabricated testimony against Sarah would now be recognized as projection and misdirection designed to protect his own criminal activities. Sarah's chains were removed with ceremonial precision by military police who now understood they had been restraining one of America's most valuable assets. As the metal fell away, her transformation was complete, revealing the bearing and presence that had made her legendary within special operations communities worldwide. Major Rodriguez found himself standing with the rest of the gallery as they offered spontaneous recognition to someone whose contributions they were only now beginning to understand. The woman they had initially viewed with suspicion or indifference was revealed as a guardian whose sacrifices had protected them all in ways they could never fully comprehend. Lieutenant Colonel Santos closed her notebook with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice prevail against overwhelming odds. Her documentation of this tribunal would become evidence in prosecutions that would reach far beyond this chamber, exposing systematic corruption that threatened national security at its foundations. Media correspondent Harrison realized she was witnessing not just the vindication of one service member but the exposure of institutional failures that demanded immediate attention from the highest levels of government. Her story would reshape public understanding of how military justice should function when confronted with genuine excellence. General Thompson addressed the chamber with words that would be remembered long after these proceedings concluded. True warriors do not seek recognition for their sacrifices, she stated, but when their service is questioned by those unworthy to understand it, truth must prevail over politics and justice over convenience. This story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and underestimated. Share this with someone who needs to remember that strength comes in many forms, and that the most powerful people are often those who serve others quietly and without expectation of reward. As Sarah Martinez walked free from the tribunal chamber, her vindication complete and her honor restored, the true meaning of service and sacrifice had been illuminated for everyone present. The chains that had bound her became symbols not of her supposed guilt but of the courage required to stand for truth when powerful forces align against justice.